delighted to have an esteemed panel of Mississippians who will discuss the author BARRY HANNA, who died in 2010. Between 1972 and 2001, Hanna published 8 novels and 4 collections of short stories. A master of short fiction, Hanna is considered by many to be one of the most important writers of modern American literature, praised for his unflinching use of language, rich metaphors, and tragically damaged characters. Conversations with BARRY HANNA, a new book published by the University Press of Mississippi and edited by James G. Thomas, Jr., collects interviews with the author, published between 1980 and 2010. Jimmy Thomas will speak to us today first. He is the Associate Director for Publications at the University of Mississippi Center for the Study of Southern Culture. He is editor of the 24-volume New Encyclopedia of Southern Culture and the Faulkner and Yoknapatawpha series. He will be followed by Taylor Kitchings, whose mother is BARRY HANNA's sister. Taylor grew up with a close relationship to his uncle, just 9 years his elder, and Kitchings himself is the author of the recently published Yard Roar, a coming-of-age tale set just after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. He lives in Ridgeland and teaches English at St. Andrews Episcopal School. Finally, George Ezell is a retired professor of biochemistry at Millsaps College. He met BARRY HANNA in 1960 when their families were neighbors in Clinton. At that time, George was an assistant professor of chemistry at Mississippi College, and Hanna was about to begin his freshman year at MC. The two carpooled to the University of Mississippi Medical Center, where they were each engaged in separate research projects. After drifting apart for a number of years, they renewed their friendship in the early 1980s and remained close friends thereafter. In 1985, Hanna dedicated his book, Captain Maximus, to George. Help me welcome Jimmy Thomas.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody, for coming today. Thanks to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History for having me also. Even I find it, well, let me preface this by saying that when I speak off the cuff, I tend to ramble, so I wrote my remarks down just to keep myself on point, but I'll try and do this with flair. Even I find it a little presumptuous to stand here and tell you, good folks, about who BARRY HANNA was, since it's likely many of you grew up with Barry or are even related to him. So perhaps I'll begin by telling you a little bit about who I am. I moved to Oxford to attend Ole Miss in August of 1990, and I started working at the local bookstore, Square Books, that same month. Now back then, when you interviewed for a job at Square Books, Richard Howarth would give you a quiz to see what you knew about books and writers and so forth, and I think that was my first introduction to BARRY HANNA. I think the question on the quiz was something like, who wrote Airships, or maybe it was Geronimo Rex. I really don't remember. But not long after that, I knew exactly who wrote Airships, and Geronimo Rex, and Captain Maximus, and Gray, and Bats Out of Hell, and Boomerang. And he changed the way I thought about writing forever. Barry visited Square Books often, probably every day, or at least it seemed like it. He and Susan lived on Van Buren Avenue in the 1990s, the same street as Square Books. I was an English major and was able to get to know him pretty well. I enrolled in Barry's undergraduate and graduate creative writing classes. I don't know that I was a particularly great storyteller, but he was always encouraging and supportive. And I'll never forget the afternoons spent in his classes in Bondurant Hall, Barry smoking cigarette after cigarette, and instructing us eager students on the craft of writing fiction. He told us stories about Gordon Lish, Raymond Carver, made us read Flannery O'Connor, James Baldwin, Richard Ford, and Eudora Welty. 2 days later, I found myself working on the campus, 2 decades later, rather. I found myself working on the campus of my alma mater with many of those who were once my professors, including Jay Watson, the editor of another volume in the Conversation series, Conversations with Larry Brown, another Oxonian. Another colleague in the English department, Joan Miley Hall, edited the Conversations for the Natasha Trethewey volume. And I wondered why there wasn't a Conversations with BARRY HANNA volume in that series. Oxford friends Howard and Sylvia Lenhoff gave me the encouragement to write just that book, or to make that book, rather. The Lenhoffs both in their 70s, were such admirers of Barry's work that they took his creative writing class at Ole Miss and afterward seeded the Barry and Susan Hanna Creative Writing Scholarship. Howard collected first editions of Barry's books and original issues of magazines in which Barry's stories had been published. And he suggested that I edit a volume of Barry's collected interviews. I approached Leila Salisbury at the press, and she encouraged me to pursue the project. The rest, as they say, is history. Editing this book gave me an incredible opportunity. I reread several of Barry's books, and I heard his voice through these printed interviews. Barry had a certain cadence to the way he spoke. He didn't speak slowly, but he spoke deliberately. Like in his writing, Barry didn't waste words. The responses to various interviewers' questions in this book contain as much poetry as did his writing. Another of the joys working on this book was the opportunity to piece together a biography of Barry Hanna, the writer. In reading these 18 interviews, which span the years between 1980 and 2010, essentially from Ray to Long Happy Last, which was published posthumously, we find responses to questions about Barry's writing process, about his experience of working with editor Gordon Lish, about his time spent in Hollywood working with filmmaker Robert Altman, and ultimately about the illness that contributed to his early death. We learn about writing projects that he abandoned, and that's one of the most fun, favorite aspects of this book, is to kind of piece together some of these projects that he was working on that we never got to read. We learn about writing projects that he abandoned and get to read passages from those works in this book. We hear Barry talk about his love of music and the enormous effect it had on his writing. Barry was a huge fan of Jimi Hendrix, and Jimi Hendrix comes up in almost every single one of these interviews, which I love. What the reader will not find are large political statements, very much discussion on his personal life and family. He was a fairly private man. Or comments on the infamous behavior for which he was sometimes known in the 1980s. In the book, Barry discusses his life as a writer, candidly, honestly, with modesty, and sometimes with hints of regret. He was a generous interview subject. In his lifetime, Barry published 8 novels and 4 collections of short stories, not including limited editions, which there are 2 that I'm aware of. His first book, Geronimo Rex, was published in 1972, earning him the William Faulkner Prize for Writing and a nomination for the National Book Award. Right out of the gate, Barry was a phenomenon, and critics praised the debut of this new American voice in literature. Writer Jim Harrison lauded Barry and his work in the New York Times, calling him, and I quote, "one of those young writers who is brilliantly drunk with words and could at gunpoint write the life story of a telephone pole." I like that. The chronology of Conversations with Barry Hanna lists 12 prizes and awards, including the Robert Penn Warren Award, the American Institute of Arts and Letters Award for Literature, a Pulitzer Prize nomination, and the Mississippi Institute of Arts and Letters Award for Fiction, twice. As I mentioned, I look at this book as a biography, or an autobiography, depending on how you look at it. For example, I report in the chronology and in the introduction that in 1942, Howard Barry Hanna was born in Meridian, Mississippi, to William and Elizabeth King Hanna, and brought home to Forest, Mississippi, in Scott County. He and his family later moved to Pascagoula, and then to Clinton, where he spent the majority of his childhood. In 1960, Barry enrolled at Mississippi College in Clinton. His first declared major was pre-med. I can't really see Barry as a doctor. I've tried to imagine it several times. I'm glad he changed his major. But his love of the written word led him to seek a degree in English instead. While there, he worked as a research assistant in pharmacology at the UM Medical Center here in Jackson. While at Mississippi College, Barry benefited from a number of positive influences, of which many you may know these people, including Pete Lipsey in history, the poet J. Edgar Simmons, and English professor Louis Dollarhide. In the interviews included in this volume, Barry mentions a number of other literary and intellectual influences before and after his time at Mississippi College. Lois Blackwell, who he called, quote, a wonderful high school teacher who taught me jazz and gave me respect for writing poems. Gave him the encouragement as both a writer and a musician. Barry, like the fictional yet autobiographical main character in Geronimo Rex, played the trumpet. Although I never got to see him play the trumpet in Oxford, and I regret missing any opportunity I may have had to do that. In 1964, Howard Barry Hanna graduated from Mississippi College with a bachelor's degree in English and entered the University of Arkansas's English Master's Program. In the interviews contained in Conversations with Barry Hanna, there is an informational gap between those years, 1942 and 1964, the years before Barry Hanna, the writer. I suspect that between now and 1 o'clock this afternoon, in hearing from Taylor and George, perhaps from some of you as well, that gap may begin to be filled. And then beyond that as well. All right, thank you.
Looking out of this room, so many of y'all know Barry or your family. So I'm probably not going to tell you, a lot of y'all, some of you don't already know. But Barry was my big brother. And he lived over in Clinton, and we were in Clinton a whole lot. Literally, my uncle, 8 years old, he wrote, when I was born. And I guess that's right, but we always said he was 9 years older than I was. One of my favorite stories about Barry, and I don't know a lot of detail. When he was 2 years old, we had relatives down at Base St. Louis, and it was either there or Pascagoula. He was walking along the beach with his parents and probably my mother. At 2 years old, he suddenly tore away from them and ran to a pier and ran all the way down the pier and jumped into the ocean. Without any warning and without, of course, knowing how to swim. And so it all worked out. They got him back to shore. For some reason that stayed with me. I think it says a lot about a 2-year-old doing that kind of thing. He introduced a kind of wild joy in being alive to me at age one day. Well, the day I met him. And I can just go over a few, adventures and some of the things that really stay with me. One thing I always appreciated about my Uncle Barry was that he would leave the adults, and when he became an adult, he would still leave the adults and go play with the nieces and nephews. And he always had a big sense of having some fun. And it didn't matter if it was a Ford Apache or electric football. I don't know. Y'all have to remember those vibration electric football games. That was it. I had 2 or 3 of them. And they were great. Actually, they were pretty horrible. I mean, you couldn't really get at the game that way, but it was kind of fun, the red team versus the yellow team going, Barry had just gotten one when he was a kid, and he was not, I must have been, 3 or 4, and I sat on it. She put a huge dent in half of the field. I remember what the dent looked like. He seemed to take it pretty well at the time, but it kind of led, he claimed in an essay about me later, it kind of led to the beginning of the terror. The period in my childhood when I was regularly terrorized by my uncle. He writes about it. This is 1998 in Oxford publication. He says, there was a time when I did terrorize him. I don't know what came over me. Perhaps original sin. Perhaps our lives were too sweetly uneventful in horror, and I had to manufacture it for him. Maybe I saw he was having it too good, and I had to invent dysfunction for him. My friend Jim Whitehead has written a marvelous poem about a boy who takes a shotgun and blows apart a chicken on the limb of a tree above his younger brother. The younger brother straightaway becomes disturbed and starts creating literature. The poem starts where the hurt began. The poem ends. Yeah, that's the ticket. I was trying to make a poet out of infant Taylor, especially after he sat and bent my vibration football game. Maybe he was a little too favored, a little too curly and dear all of a sudden. Understand me? Maybe it was the onslaught of my own ugly puberty, all its rashes and snarl. I began with a hideous rubber mask and waited upwards of half an hour for him to come to the room of play alone, where I trembled with glee in the closet. I burst out, and the little man in his velvet Fauntleroy suit froze, all plate-eyed, and then fell squarely backwards on the rug, where he could not move a while for paralysis. At last, still speechless with perhaps the first metaphysical terror of his life, he rose on his legs and wobbled out. I heard his howl among the grown-ups in the other room a whole minute later. By that time, I entered innocently from another direction, as my kind uncle's self. What is it? What's wrong? Well, I'll be. That's what it was like. And I remember a story that he didn't use here was a friend of his calling me into his bedroom. And I don't know, I was probably 5 or 6. Taylor, Uncle Barry wants to see you. And I walk in the room, it's a dark room, nobody was in there, there's a little bit of light. And he'll be here in a minute. I sat on the bed, and all of a sudden over at the window, outside, is a creature with a stocking over his face and a knife clawing at the screen. And, you know, those kind of shocks were just, you never knew when they would happen. So it is, he writes here, he's amazed that I'm sane. I don't know about that, but it is kind of amazing the extent to which I survived it. He had a rubber hand that would show up in odd places, kitchen cat, just a disembodied claw that would show up in the trunk of your car or somewhere you never knew. Barry liked to tease all of us. I wasn't just the only one singled out for special torture. One of his favorite games with the nieces and nephews was Pain. And he would say, you know, well, it's time to play Pain. I don't know, remember the kid, I know most remember this. He would line us up. And it was probably my family and maybe Bob and John was still in town. They moved to Kansas City. At some point, it was Christmas and everybody was there. And we all had to line up and watch while he imitated a cheerleader who, in the middle of the routine, is just suddenly afflicted with an indescribable affliction that really contrasts with the cheers. And it was bound to make you at least smile. But if you revealed any reaction to the humor, you would feel the pinch. It wasn't bad. It wasn't bad. But it was kind of creative, really, if you think about it. It was the Pain game. And it just matured in its way. He wasn't very old. He was just a genius of horror. And he went on to love horror movies his whole life. We tried to find really special ones. I know Lee used to give him one for birthdays. It was hard to find one he hadn't seen or that really got weird enough for him. But if you did, that was a triumph. Well, from my childhood in Clinton, I remember huge black elastic bands that were rigged onto custom-made rubber band guns that could inflict some damage. And we would use them ostensibly not on each other, but somehow that always happened. But we would set up soldiers like in the Fort Apache and shoot at them and have wars. I remember Uncle Barry showing me how to play football, really, out in the front yard, grandmother's front yard, which is the yard that I based my yard on. And the sidewalk down the middle and the trees and the rose bed at the end. And he showed me all the rules and he would play with us. And that was just the coolest thing. He was really so kind. He was so kind. And he wanted to, I mean, it was easy for him. He wasn't making an effort to play with the kids. He just shared your excitement about whatever was going on. He wanted to be part of it. And, well, images include Kirk Douglas on the wall of his bedroom as the one-eyed Viking warrior from the Vikings. Do anybody remember the Vikings? The 58, 59? That was one of his heroes. Miles Davis was a hero early on of his, and he did play that trumpet. And I remember vividly Barry sitting back in his room and playing that trumpet and getting the spit out and playing some more. And how much he loved it. What a big, bold, beautiful sound he could make on it. I always thought he would keep playing. Well, he did keep playing. He claimed he just didn't ever like to practice, and that's why he didn't get further on the trumpet. But he loved music from the very beginning. So music, love of adventure, wild, intense, unexpected, humor, a lot of the veins in his writing were there, obviously, from the time I knew him, from the time I was a little kid. He and his friends were very funny. Wyatt Newman, who died last September, used to go to the drive-in movie with Wyatt and Horace and watch them mock whatever was happening on the screen. It was like Mystery Science Theater, 3,000, 20 years, 40, whatever, before its time. They were just funny and smart people. And so it didn't get cooler. It did not get any cooler than Uncle Barry. When I was in June of 1967, when Sergeant Pepper's came out, I was probably the recipient of the biggest honor that he ever gave me when he invited me to spend a week in Fayetteville with him up at grad school in Arkansas. And I got to meet Jim Whitehead and William Harrison and hang out and shoot pool. And we listened to Between the Buttons, Rolling Stones. He loved that. We listened to Highway 61 revisited over and over. He said he loved every word of it. It was intense and urgent and loving. Bob Dylan, the Beatles, of course. He turned me on to a whole lot of books. And every night, way after I had gone to bed, for as long as I was awake, I heard him in the next room typing away and laughing all the time about whatever he was creating. I didn't know what he was creating. It was going to be his thesis for the MFA, and of course it was Geronimo Rex. So that image of a guy working in a little apartment, the academic image there, that was indelible for me after that. I thought, this is the coolest thing you can do. Well, it was anything Uncle Barry. Had he been a mechanic or a doctor or whatever, that would have been the coolest thing because he was Uncle Barry. But to live with him that week and watch that life meant so much to me. And then, what was cooler, what could be cooler, than to go to college and have his book come out and have people come up to you and say they just can't believe your uncle is Barry Hanna. He's their favorite writer ever. Because who could do those kind of things with words? He would do unexpected things, like in the 1980s when he went briefly, I was taking a nap and somebody pounded on the door, ran to the door, and there he was with Tom McGuane. I said, he said, "Oh, Taylor, Tom McGuane." Love your work, man. I was amazed and honored, and we went and had lunch at George Street Grocery because Laura, his wife, was down here doing cutting horses at the rodeo. So the surprises continued, and the love and the fun and the humor continued. I have a lot of letters that I just chose not to share. I would get emotional, and it wouldn't make any sense to anyone else, probably a lot of them. But he was my hero and is still, and I miss him every day. I know y'all have your own stories. Everybody, half the people in this room to be up here. Don't want to leave anything out. I think the last image I'll leave you with is fishing. We loved fishing. We went to Edward Ratliff's pond with my granddaddy, and usually fished off the bank. Sometimes we had a boat and we'd go out there, and strange things, unexpected things would happen, and I really can't go into it. But some of it was my fault. Like I left the gate open one time, and suddenly there were cattle all over, everywhere. We had to round up all the cattle, and Barry was he was again so kind. He didn't fuss at me about it, and when he explained it all to everyone, he said, "I'm just so sorry this happened." As if some agency beyond anyone's control had left that gate open. So he kept me out of trouble, you know. And then, later I lived with him briefly up in Oxford when I went to get a master's, and it was a difficult time for him. Me and Poe were up there. We're all in this huge old house out in the country, and I just about decided that I couldn't make it, couldn't live there. And one morning at 3 o'clock, I opened my eyes, and Barry was standing by my bed in full fishing regalia, holding a tackle box and rod and reel. He said, "Taylor, I know what we need to do. We need to go fishing." And he meant it right then. So that was standard. That was a Barry answer to the trolls of this world. Let's just go fishing. And I treasure the memories that I have of him. By the fishing hole. Well, in fact, by the fishing hole is where I met George Ezell, so that's probably a good segue, and I will hand it over to him.
It's kind of tough following Jimmy and Taylor. I'm at a loss of what I want to say now. I really had not meant to dwell on a lot of the adventures I had with Barry between 1981 and 1987 probably. But Taylor did remind me of Barry's playfulness, I would say, playing jokes on you, scaring you to death. And I will tell you one incident. This happened down in Florida at Mexico Beach. Alan, my wife, and family would go down to Mexico Beach every year for a week vacation, and a couple of times Barry came down to visit with us. And one time he came down, and had been there a week, and we were about ready to pack up and go home the next day. In fact, I think I was asleep in a lounge chair out on this big screen porch overlooking the Gulf. Barry came up to me and he said, "George," he said, "we need to talk." He said, "Let's go get in my car and drive down the beach." So he shook me awake, got in the car, a little Datsun 610 that had an alternator light that was red all the time, never went out. But we stopped at one place called the Lookout Lounge. Went in, there's nobody in the lounge but Barry and me and the fellow who owned the bar. We stayed there a while, and Barry got ready to leave. We went further down the beach. We stopped at a beachwear place, I guess you would call it. I don't really know what it was, but down underneath it was a redneck bar. And any of you know about Mexico Beach, it's not very far from Tyndall Air Force Base. And there were an awful lot of airmen in there at that night. And to give you a little bit of the atmosphere of the place, it was a place that didn't have any refrigeration. The long necks were in styrofoam chests. And there were a couple of pool tables. And just a whole press of people. And we walk in there, and most of the time that Barry and I were having our adventures together, he gave us titles. Titles of rank in the Air Force. Barry would be the commander. I would be the lieutenant commander. And he got me in some dangerous situation. We went in there, and I didn't know that Barry had been there earlier in the day and met some people. So we walk in, and he walks up to 2 or 3 people that he had met earlier, and he said, I want to introduce you to my friend, Lieutenant Commander George Ezell. He said, we both went over to Vietnam together, but I couldn't kill good as Barry. But George stayed, and he was an ace. So I said, when were you in Vietnam? And I said, when were you in Vietnam? He said, 1972. And I said, I wasn't there then. But there was a young woman in there waiting for her boyfriend to come. And Barry went up to her and got in conversation with her, and he was telling all about him being a writer, et cetera, and mentioned the fact that we were pilots and we'd been in Vietnam. So after a while, the boyfriend comes in. He's just come down from Georgia, and Barry goes and starts playing pool. He leaves me with the boyfriend, who has also heard the story that we were pilots in Vietnam. And we're sitting there, side by side, and he says to me, now I can't hear very well out of this ear. He had gotten too close to a gun report in Vietnam and had gotten deaf in that ear, but he said, you know, I really don't care for people who say they've been in Vietnam and they haven't been there. And he said, there are 3 questions I could ask and let me know whether somebody's been in Vietnam or not. And I thought, uh-oh, this is not going to be good. So he asked the first question. And before I could say anything, he answered. And he did that with the second question and the third. And then he looked at me and he said, what'd you say you did in Vietnam? I said, I don't like to talk about it. And he said, me either. That ended that conversation. Went outside and found Barry with some other pilots. Took him home. So he would play jokes on me. And that wasn't the only time he got me in trouble like that. I was thinking, when Chris asked me if I would come and talk, what can I say? Chris said, you can talk about anything you want to. And I said, oh, no, I can't. So it occurred to me, I had these letters that Barry wrote to me in the early 80s, from about 81 until 86, I guess. And I thought if I would read some of the excerpts from these letters, it might be interesting to you, just to give you another slant on Barry as a person as well as a writer. And the first one I'm going to read a portion of to you. He wrote to me in June of 1981 when he was back out in San Pedro, California. I think everybody knows Barry had gone out there and not only worked with Robert Altman in 1980, but had gone out there to get cleaned up and get healthy. And he had come back in the spring of 1981, and as Taylor said, I introduced him to Tom McGuane. So he took me over to meet Tom McGuane at the Cutting Horse Show in Laurie and Jimmy Buffett's sister. But anyway, he was staying in a house over in Belhaven Heights that belonged to, or was rented by Ken Kitchings. Ken, where are you? There you go. You remember that, don't you, Ken?
Oh, yeah.
And I was teaching over at Millsaps, and I would go over and visit with him sometimes. And he was be sitting at a kitchen table with a big easel and newsprint on it. And he was writing this Jimi Hendrix story and calling it Hey Joe. And he worked on that for a while, but then Barry had a relapse, and he had to go back out to San Pedro, and he had not finished the Jimi Hendrix story as he told me that he had. So what he says in this letter is, George, love the note. The Calvin Melvin piece is fit out with good detail. Probably needs more to happen. This is where fiction comes in. Just lie your head off like me at the height of a drunk. Said, sometimes it works. Good vibes along the way from the Pacific to the Atlantic. Saw a sea slug in the Venice Canal the other day, working on the native slime. Was such an awful aspect, I went home and wrote about it immediately. The thing is so nasty, it's its own, and I can't say this word, symbol. I had to kind of edit these letters. Quisenberry's here. John Quisenberry was his bosom buddy from childhood in Clinton that was a pilot in Vietnam, and Barry used very often in his stories, and is the one who got Barry to go into treatment when he went out to California the first time. He says, Quisenberry's here, lorrying away. I stay here in my lonely hovel in Pedro, racing on Hey Joe, which I must finish for huge bucks. And I have to leave it at that point. But he was still working on the Jimi Hendrix book and calling it Hey Joe in 1981. Somewhere along the way, Hey Joe changed over to be Maximum Ned, and something happened to Maximum Ned that eventually that title sort of worked itself into Captain Maximus. And I'll read you a little bit from some of these letters to show you the evolution of that. This letter was written in 1984. He said, in Maximum Ned, I've got a story called Watch Out, it's a big one, about us at Mexico Beach. Sort of. I hope you'll enjoy. Just put the last touches on it last night. Wishing you Godspeed, Lieutenant Commander Barry Hanna. The next letter he wrote, at the top he puts Lieutenant Commander, out by Barry Hanna. I was at Oak Ridge, Tennessee that year doing some research, and Barry was writing me when I went up at Oak Ridge. He said, this is in September of '84, George, my captain, not only not forgetting you, but sending this by Oxford airmail. They use an old Stearman here, and it should be there in 5 days. Stearman is the old crop dusting plane. Just full of various humor. He says, today's the day the Rebs take on Memphis State. The old man's here looking good, that's his dad. Brought enough food to feed an army. Butter beans, okra, corn, tomatoes, steaks. If I can catch some fish and hit a few doves, maybe a deer, we might not have any grocery bill this winter. Of course, Barry was not a deer. And I don't know if he ever shot dove or not either, but he did love guns. He says, Max Ned, and in parentheses, Gordon, that's Gordon Lish, his editor, doesn't like the title. Max Ned's in production. Just signed the contract a couple days ago. Pray for the bucks, and I'll just sit here and write more stories. 20 stories called Never Die is my plan. Never Die got written, but it was not a book of short stories. But things change. A little bit later in the fall, when I was still at Oak Ridge, he said, George wanted to know if you were behaving and what the radioactive fish are doing for you. Me, I ain't caught nothing lately because it rains and rains and rains. Got a bad head cold, feel like crap until I wake up. An hour with contact in me. Nothing else is wrong, and I figure maybe I'm living for at least another week. This note is also to express my thanks for your enduring friendship and loyalty. Red, watch out, it's a big one to the Tennessee Library Association, and they liked it. So, Captain Maximus, new title, will please at least a few, I know, and I hope you're proud of it. Like the lieutenant commander I am, now self-promoted to captain, I went ahead bravely and fired with all my guns. When things get tough, the tough get going. And what he was talking about there was that morning he had gotten up early and stumbled into the mantel in his house and gotten a black eye. And so he said he could never remember having had a black eye before, but he went ahead bravely. He fired all of his guns. And we're getting kind of close to where I need to wrap this up. Some of the letters that he wrote to me when he was at Oxford in '84, he was having the small town blues, as he called it. And he was in a kind of low point in his life. And Captain Maximus was coming out in May of 1985, and he was saying to me before that happened, maybe we could do something to cheer him up. And so we gave a little party for Barry out at my house. Some of you were there. And so it did cheer him up a little bit. But the thing I wanted to close on was Barry, as he said to me many times, he looked at me as his lieutenant commander, as his co-pilot or his second seat or whatever. And I guess I was in that role at least part of the time until he met Susan Vargas. And Susan took over as the second seat and the co-pilot, and I was able to get out of the service. But this letter is dated October 1985, and it's to me and to Aunt Lois. He said, well, this fall is really looking up. I knew bad luck had had enough of me, so I got some good stuff in the name of one Mrs. Susan Vargas. This seems to be real and long time. Might even get married, like you other fools. Can't wait for you to meet her. She's blonde, 39, mother of 2, and I'm nuts about her. Met her at the Hoka some 3 weeks ago. Asked her to marry me instantly. Yes, I was drunk, still, from New Orleans, but this is the only time I ever brought anything much good from a binge. Sober, it seems to be a miracle. So friends, I am very happy and healthy. And then the very last letter that I want to read a little bit to you from was written in April of 1986 from Oxford. Dear George and Aunt Lois, I'm hoping you're fine and swell and in love and all that, because I surely am. I think I've lucked up and made a wise decision, and marriage feels good. Life, as they say, proceeds apace. My classes are good here, and the prospects for a good life in Oxford increase. I've not written as well as I'd like to lately, but everything else is going okay, and I'm not complaining. We're looking forward to your visit soon, anytime in fact. We've got the bedroom for it, and the spring is very pretty here. Best to you in your endeavors, Barry.
Time for questions, if anybody has any, their own stories.
This is really not a question, it's a comment. I went to school with Barry in Clinton for 12 years, and I had a marvelous opportunity. But one story I want to tell you is that about pied beauty. You mentioned Lois Blackwell as our English teacher. She got to go up with us 2 or 3 years. So we had her a long time, and she was great. So she gave this assignment. I don't remember what I did with it, but I remember what Barry did with it. He wrote about pied beauty. And I can't remember now if it was a poem or if it was a short story. But he wrote about the pods of excrement that cows make in the pasture.
I'm Harry Joe Brown, otherwise known as Bobby Dove Fleece, from Geronimo Rex, which unfortunately was true in too many places. I'm sorry about my voice, but I roomed with Barry as a freshman. We were at Clinton High School together for our entire high school careers. But I remember one time we both smoked at Mississippi College. That was an excellent defiance. But one morning I had bought a package of mint lifesavers, and he had a sore throat. I gave him one. He enjoyed it, and then he made a classical Barry statement. He said, "You know, these would be a good habit for somebody that didn't smoke." So we all had to have a habit.
Questions? All right. Jimmy's book, Taylor's book, and Barry's books are here. We'll be glad to sell and sign. Thank you.
Going to introduce.
Yeah. I think that's it. Thank you all.